August 1944. The night sky over Japan is thick with tension, a darkness that feels like it's closing in from all sides. Far above, invisible to the naked eye, something far more ominous moves through the air. The distant sound of engines, a deep rumbling growl that grows louder by the minute. For Japanese pilots stationed on the ground, it is a sound that strikes terror into their hearts. They know what's coming. It's the B-29 superfortress, an enemy so powerful, so relentless that its mere presence in the sky means certain death. The air feels heavier tonight. This isn't the first raid, and it won't be the last. The Japanese pilots, tired from months of defending their homeland, have already faced wave after wave of these bombers, and each time, the result is the same. The B-29s return, night after night, bringing with them destruction, death, and the reminder that they are losing a battle they cannot win. In the cockpit, a young Japanese pilot grips his controls, sweat beading on his forehead. He has been in the air for hours tracking the incoming B-29s, and yet, the enemy bombers seem to multiply in number each night. They've adapted their tactics, and no matter how fast or how hard he tries to intercept them, the B-29s seem to glide through the sky like shadows, untouched by the few fighters sent to meet them. His heart races, his mind numbed by the constant pressure. But there is no escape, no respite. The sound of those engines grows louder, and the weight of fear presses down on him. He knows the drill. The B-29s will come again tomorrow night and the night after that, and each time he'll be there waiting, powerless, terrified. The Pacific War was reaching a critical turning point by the summer of 1944. The Allied forces had successfully established a foothold in the Pacific, moving steadily toward Japan after key victories at places like Midway, Guadalcanal, and Saipan. But even as the Allies advanced, the Japanese military, battered but determined, continued to defend their homeland with fierce tenacity. The air war in the Pacific was evolving, and by the fall of 1944, one of the most formidable threats to Japan's defense strategy had taken shape: the Boeing B-29 superfortress. The B-29 was a technological marvel, the pinnacle of American aerial warfare. It was a long-range heavy bomber designed specifically for the task of striking deep into enemy territory. With a range of over 3,000 miles and the ability to carry up to 20,000 pounds of bombs, the B-29 could fly across vast stretches of the Pacific Ocean, drop its payload on Japanese cities, and return to base, all without refueling. This strategic advantage made the B-29 the weapon of choice for America's Pacific bombing campaign. For the Japanese, this new threat was a game-changer. The B-29s arrived in the skies over Japan at a time when their air defenses were already stretched thin. By 1944, Japan had already endured years of intense bombing from American forces, but the B-29s brought a new level of destruction that the Japanese military was unprepared for. The bombers were faster, higher flying, and more resilient than anything Japan had encountered before. With their pressurized cabins, advanced radar systems, and heavy defensive armament, the B-29 seemed virtually immune to the small and outmatched Japanese interceptors. The raids were part of a broader strategy, developed by the United States Army Air Forces, USF, to cripple Japan's industrial heartland and break the will of the Japanese people. The campaign began with large-scale bombing raids aimed at key military and industrial targets. But by the summer of 1944, it was clear that Japan's cities and infrastructure were increasingly vulnerable. The U.S. began to focus its efforts on the Japanese home islands, particularly Tokyo and other urban centers, in an attempt to destroy Japan's war-making capacity. But the B-29's most devastating impact was psychological. Japanese pilots, already worn down from months of defending against air raids, found themselves outmatched by these new bombers. They had little time to adapt their tactics, and their dwindling resources made it even harder to mount an effective defense. The Japanese military's early attempts to intercept B-29s were hampered by a lack of advanced radar systems, and their fighter aircraft, while capable, were simply not fast enough or equipped to take on the new enemy in the skies. The Japanese Air Force, particularly the Imperial Japanese Army Air Service, IJAF, and the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service, IJNAS, had already been struggling to cope with the Allied air superiority. By the time the B-29s began their nightly raids, the situation had become even more dire. Japan's aircraft production was falling behind, and the training of pilots was suffering. Even if they managed to scramble a fighter to intercept a B-29, it was often too late. The pilots were exhausted, often lacking fuel, and their planes were frequently in disrepair. For the Japanese defenders, the arrival of the B-29s was a turning point. They realized that their efforts to defend their skies were becoming increasingly futile. The bombers came relentlessly, and no matter how many pilots they lost or how much anti-aircraft fire they threw at the sky, the B-29s kept returning. The Japanese military's response to the B-29 raids was as much a psychological battle as it was a tactical one. In the early days of the raids, Japan's air defense strategy was built on intercepting American bombers with their existing fleet of fighters and bombers, but it quickly became clear that these methods were ineffective against the B-29's advanced technology and higher altitude capabilities. Japan's existing fighters, including the Mitsubishi A6M0, were simply not capable of reaching the altitudes necessary to engage the B-29s effectively. And the problem wasn't just with the aircraft themselves. Japan's lack of radar systems, along with poor coordination between fighter squadrons and anti-aircraft artillery, meant that any efforts to shoot down the bombers were scattered and disjointed. In response, Japan's military shifted tactics. Fighters were equipped with new modifications, and more aggressive nighttime interception missions were launched. However, these adjustments were limited by the resources Japan had left. Pilots and aircraft were in short supply, while Allied intelligence had already gained a critical edge in terms of operational knowledge. The B-29 crews, aware of the increasing pressure placed on Japan's defenses, also adapted their tactics, operating in well-coordinated formations that made it even harder for Japanese pilots to intercept them. The raids themselves were designed to keep Japan's military on constant alert. By bombing at night, when the enemy's defenses were often at their weakest, the U.S. Air Force ensured that Japanese pilots would be forced to defend their airspace without rest. Even when the bombers weren't attacking, the mere threat of another raid kept the defenders exhausted and mentally worn down. This strategy of overwhelming psychological pressure was not only intended to disrupt Japan's industrial base, but to erode the morale of its defenders. To further compound the psychological toll, Japanese pilots had begun to hear whispers of the effectiveness of the American bombers, the growing number of B-29 sorties, and the incredible precision with which these bombers carried out their raids. Reports circulated that entire neighborhoods in Tokyo had been reduced to rubble, that civilians were fleeing in panic, and that fire bombings were destroying key infrastructure. The bombers were not simply targeting military sites. They were targeting the heart of Japan's civilian life, eroding the morale of both the military and the public. For Japanese pilots, this created an acute sense of dread. Not only were they being outclassed in the sky, but their very country was under siege. Night after night, the B-29s would come again. They were not just a physical threat, but a persistent reminder that the war was slipping away from Japan, and that every attempt to stop the bombers only seemed to bring more devastation. As the raids continued, it became increasingly clear to the pilots and to the civilians below that this new type of warfare, constant, relentless, and increasingly brutal, was designed to break them, mentally and physically. The stress of this endless cycle took its toll on the pilots, many of whom were young men thrust into one of the most desperate phases of aerial warfare. Despite their bravery, the odds were stacked against them. They were up against machines that could fly higher, faster, and farther than their own. And though their own planes were capable of remarkable feats, the balance of technological power was tipping in favor of the United States. By 1945, Japan's leadership was facing a difficult reality. The military high command began to recognize that they could not match the B-29's capabilities head-on. In desperation, they began to consider alternative strategies, including the deployment of kamikaze tactics, which would soon define the final stages of Japan's air war. But these strategies were born not from strength but from fear of the bombers that came night after night, relentless in their destruction. For the Japanese pilots, the B-29 raids were more than just a military challenge. They were a psychological torment. Unlike any other opponent they had faced, the B-29 superfortress was an enemy that seemed to materialize out of the night, returning again and again without warning. The sheer relentlessness of these night raids created a mental toll that weighed heavily on the pilots, who were tasked with defending their homeland. By the time the B-29s began their sustained campaigns over Japan, many Japanese pilots had already been through months, if not years, of relentless combat. Their numbers were thinning, and their morale was at its breaking point. Pilots who had once felt the pride of defending their nation were now burdened with the knowledge that their efforts were increasingly futile. As one pilot later recalled, the arrival of the B-29s was not just an enemy attack. It was a constant reminder of their inability to win. The raids were disheartening in their regularity. No sooner would one wave of bombers be repelled than another would arrive. Each time the bombers returned, the psychological strain grew. The fear was palpable among the pilots. They knew the B-29 was a technological marvel. It flew higher, it flew farther, and it was shielded by a formidable defense system. The Japanese pilots could often hear the thunderous sound of the bombers' engines before they could even see them. But by the time they spotted them, it was often too late. Even if they managed to close the distance, there was little they could do to bring the bombers down before they released their payload. The constant failure to intercept these bombers instilled a sense of helplessness. Beyond the immediate fear of being outclassed in combat, the pilots were haunted by the implications of the raids on Japan's civilian population. These bombing runs were not just attacks on military targets. They destroyed entire cities, wiped out homes, and killed thousands of civilians. The psychological toll of knowing that every failure to stop the B-29s resulted in more death and destruction weighed heavily on the pilots. They were not just fighting to defend their airspace, but to defend the lives of the people they cared for. Yet despite their courage and resolve, the constant bombardment and the growing body count took its toll. For many, the fear of failure became as significant as the fear of death itself. From a tactical standpoint, Japan's air defenses were woefully unprepared for the B-29 superfortress. The bomber's advanced technology and strategic capabilities outmatched anything the Japanese had in their arsenal. Japan's fighter planes, like the Mitsubishi A6M0, were formidable in their own right, but they were designed for different types of combat and lacked the altitude capability needed to challenge the B-29s, which could fly as high as 30,000 feet. The Japanese fighters, even at their best, could not reach the same altitudes without exhausting their fuel reserves, leaving them vulnerable to being shot down in the pursuit. Furthermore, Japan's air defense radar systems were rudimentary at best. American bombers could often approach the Japanese coast undetected until they were within striking distance. Japan's anti-aircraft artillery was ineffective against high-flying bombers, and the nation's radar systems were primitive in comparison to those employed by the U.S. military. When the B-29s would arrive, often in the dead of night, Japan's defense network was frequently scrambling to respond. Compounding this problem was the sheer exhaustion that plagued Japanese pilots. By 1944, many pilots had been in combat for years, and the rapid attrition of experienced airmen left behind a younger, less experienced group. These pilots were often sent into combat without sufficient rest or proper training on how to fight against such a technologically superior opponent. The constant barrage of B-29 raids only compounded their fatigue, which in turn led to more mistakes and more failed attempts to intercept the bombers. While Japan made some attempts to develop specialized countermeasures, such as night fighter versions of their existing planes and bombers, these efforts came too late and lacked the resources to be effective. As a result, the tactical reality of fighting the B-29s became an overwhelming challenge for Japan's air forces, forcing them to rely increasingly on desperate measures, such as kamikaze attacks, to try to turn the tide. As the B-29 raids became a nightly reality for Japan, the country's military leadership was forced to reassess its air defense strategy. By the time the bombers began their sustained campaigns over Japan's home islands in 1944, the Japanese High Command had already suffered severe setbacks. The loss of key territories in the Pacific, the weakening of their supply lines, and the crippling shortage of trained pilots and aircraft had made the defense of Japan's airspace a nearly impossible task. The arrival of the B-29s only underscored the magnitude of the challenge they faced. Initially, the Japanese response to the B-29 raids was fragmented. Despite recognizing the threat, their leadership struggled to mount a coordinated and effective defense. The lack of radar systems combined with poor coordination between the Army and Navy air forces meant that even when bombers were spotted, Japan's interceptors could not mobilize quickly enough to mount a meaningful challenge. The leadership's failure to prioritize the integration of their air defense efforts made Japan's response even more disjointed. As the raids continued, Japan's leadership grew desperate. They were forced to adapt quickly to a threat they had underestimated. One of the major responses to the B-29s was the development of new tactics, including night fighter units, that would attempt to intercept the bombers during the cover of darkness. However, this initiative was handicapped by a shortage of both capable aircraft and experienced pilots. The Japanese military attempted to modify their existing aircraft to meet the demands of high-altitude intercepts. But these efforts were only partially successful. With no clear answer to the B-29 threat, Japan's military leaders began to explore more drastic measures. In early 1945, the concept of kamikaze suicide attacks became central to Japan's air defense strategy. Desperation had set in. With their air forces on the brink of collapse, the Japanese military turned to the idea of using pilots as human weapons, deliberately sacrificing aircraft and lives in an attempt to destroy the B-29s. The leaders, though deeply aware of the human cost, saw no other viable option. These suicide missions were not just a sign of tactical failure. They were an acknowledgement of the psychological toll the B-29s had taken on the Japanese high command. Unable to effectively challenge the bombers through conventional means, Japan's leadership ultimately resorted to a desperate and tragic measure. The shift in strategy from attempting to intercept the bombers to using suicide tactics marked a critical juncture in Japan's war efforts and symbolized their inability to overcome the B-29 threat. The psychological toll of the B-29 raids extended far beyond the military pilots defending Japan's airspace. The civilian population, too, lived under the constant threat of the bombers, and their suffering was compounded by the relentless nighttime attacks. The raids on Japan were not confined to military targets alone. Entire neighborhoods, schools, and factories were bombed. The night sky over Japan became a harbinger of destruction, and the fear of the B-29s became ingrained in the collective consciousness of the nation. For civilians, the sound of the bombers' engines in the distance was a signal that the inevitable was approaching. Another night of firebombing, another night of terror. Entire cities were reduced to rubble, and with each raid the psychological scars deepened. The constant threat of death eroded the morale of the civilian population, who could do nothing to stop the bombers. As food supplies dwindled and the country's infrastructure crumbled, Japan's ability to continue the war weakened. But it wasn't just physical destruction that took its toll. It was the emotional weight of living in constant fear. For the pilots, the pressure was even greater. They weren't just defending their country. They were defending their families, their friends, their homes. Yet despite their sacrifices, they saw the destruction continue night after night. The weight of responsibility, combined with the overwhelming odds, wore them down. For some, the B-29 raids led to a sense of despair, the realization that no matter how hard they fought, the enemy would return. Their morale plummeted, and the weariness from the endless nights of combat left many pilots emotionally and physically drained. The knowledge that they could never completely halt the bombings, and that they could not stop the inevitable collapse, only deepened the emotional toll. The civilians and pilots, together in their shared terror, felt the burden of a war they could not escape. The relentless arrival of the B-29s had transformed the skies into an unyielding, terrifying battlefield. One where the cost of survival was paid not just in lives lost, but in the loss of hope. The night of June 15, 1945, marked a turning point in the aerial war over Japan. By this time, the B-29 superfortresses had become a regular and unrelenting presence in the skies. Each passing night, more bombers flew over Japan, and with each mission, the toll on both the civilian population and the Japanese pilots grew heavier. The psychological strain was palpable. The Japanese air defense forces had tried everything: new tactics, new aircraft modifications, and increasingly desperate countermeasures, but they were no match for the B-29's technological superiority and the relentless nature of the bombing raids. On that particular night, the skies were especially heavy with the low rumble of B-29 engines. The Japanese fighters had been scrambled again, but the air was thick with a sense of futility. The pilots knew their chances of intercepting the bombers were slim. One pilot later described the feeling as chasing shadows. Despite their best efforts, the bombers continued to deliver devastating payloads, and the attempts to intercept them felt like futile gestures against an enemy that refused to relent. This was the moment when it became clear. The B-29s were not just a threat. They were an inevitability. Japan's defensive efforts, already stretched to their limits, could no longer keep pace with the growing power and presence of the American bombers. It was during this time that Japan's leadership realized that they could not simply rely on conventional strategies to defeat the B-29s. The war in the air had evolved beyond a struggle of attrition. It had become a battle of survival, one that required a shift in tactics and ultimately a desperate final measure. The turning point came in the form of the kamikaze pilots. In the summer of 1945, as Japan's military began to accept the hopelessness of defending their airspace with conventional tactics, the leaders turned to a strategy that would define the final, tragic phase of Japan's war effort. The kamikaze attacks, born from a combination of desperation and an unwavering belief in sacrifice for the homeland, became the last-ditch effort to stop the B-29s. The kamikaze tactics, meaning divine wind, were an expression of total commitment to the war effort. Pilots, knowing that their chances of survival were negligible, flew their planes directly into B-29 formations, hoping to destroy or damage as many bombers as possible. These suicide missions were not just a tactic. They were the final symbolic act of defiance from a nation that knew it was losing the war. In their minds, it was the only way to strike back at the overwhelming force of the B-29 superfortresses that had come to dominate their skies. This shift in tactics, however, highlighted the true cost of the B-29 raids, not just in the physical destruction of Japan's cities, but in the psychological and emotional toll they exacted on a nation's very will to fight. The arrival of the B-29s had irreversibly altered the course of the air war over Japan, and now the very idea of aerial combat was being transformed. The pilots who had once flown with the hope of defending their homeland were now driven by a singular purpose: to die in the hope of striking down an enemy that seemed unbeatable. As the summer of 1945 wore on, the B-29 raids intensified. Their strikes now aimed at crippling the heart of Japan's remaining industrial capacity. The U.S. Air Forces, having perfected their tactics, launched some of the most devastating raids of the war, including the infamous firebombing of Tokyo in March and other major urban centers. The B-29s were not merely symbols of American technological superiority. They had become the instruments of Japan's undoing, hammering the country into submission. For the Japanese pilots, the desperation they felt reached a fever pitch. The kamikaze missions, though initially seen as a last-ditch attempt to slow the American advance, became a central tactic in Japan's defense efforts. The psychological weight of this strategy was immense, not just for the pilots flying these missions, but for the entire nation. The idea of sacrificing one's life for the greater good had long been part of Japan's military tradition, but now it was pushed to its extreme. Pilots began to volunteer for these suicidal missions in increasing numbers. The Japanese High Command, seeing no alternative, turned to the kamikaze tactic as their primary weapon to combat the overwhelming presence of the B-29s. The human cost of this strategy was staggering. The pilots knew they would not return. They were armed with nothing but the conviction that their sacrifice might delay, or even stop, the B-29s from completing their destructive raids. But even as the kamikaze tactics escalated, the B-29s continued their relentless assault. As Japanese pilots hurtled toward the bombers, they were met with stiff resistance from the well-armored superfortresses, whose gunners unleashed a hellish barrage of fire in an attempt to ward off the incoming fighters. The chances of a kamikaze pilot successfully hitting a B-29 were slim. But the very presence of these suicide missions was a clear sign that Japan had no other recourse. They had been forced into a corner, and now the skies over Japan were filled with the desperate echoes of a nation trying and failing to hold back an unstoppable force. The American B-29s, meanwhile, seemed unfazed. They continued to fly night after night, a constant presence in the skies above Japan. Their crews, too, had become weary, having flown thousands of miles to carry out their missions. Yet despite the physical and mental exhaustion, the bombers pressed on, fully aware of the impact their raids were having on the Japanese people and military. The B-29s were not just destroying buildings, they were eroding the will to fight, leaving the Japanese with little hope of recovery. By August 1945, the B-29 raids had caused unimaginable devastation to Japan's cities. The cumulative effect of the bombings was clear. Japan's industrial infrastructure was in ruins. The civilian population was demoralized and starving, and the country's air defenses had collapsed under the weight of repeated B-29 assaults. The kamikaze attacks, though a valiant effort, had not stopped the bombers. In the end, the B-29 raids had achieved what they were meant to do. They crippled Japan's ability to continue the war. In the days that followed, Japan's leaders, now facing a hopeless military situation, sought terms for surrender. The B-29s had not only destroyed Japan's cities, they had also broken the spirit of a nation that had once fought with fierce resolve. As Japan prepared to capitulate to the Allies, the B-29's role in the war would become a symbol of both victory and tragedy, of a technological breakthrough that changed the nature of warfare forever, but also of the devastation that comes when an unstoppable force meets a broken nation. The aftermath of the B-29 superfortress raids was nothing short of catastrophic for Japan. By the time the war ended in September 1945, the toll taken on the country, physically, economically, and psychologically, was staggering. The B-29 raids, in combination with the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, had effectively sealed Japan's fate. Yet the true magnitude of the destruction unleashed by the B-29s extended far beyond the immediate devastation of Japan's cities. The bombings had decimated Japan's industrial infrastructure. Key factories, transportation hubs, and military installations were reduced to rubble, crippling the nation's ability to continue the war effort. But perhaps even more profoundly, the B-29 raids had destroyed the very heart of Japan's civilian life. The firebombing raids, in particular, left entire neighborhoods in ashes. By the summer of 1945, major cities like Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya had been gutted. What remained of Japan's infrastructure was often unrecognizable, and the once proud urban centers were now little more than smoldering ruins. Millions of civilians were left homeless, and an estimated 300,000 people had been killed in the air raids alone. The psychological impact of these bombings was immense. The B-29s had not only destroyed Japan's physical landscape, but had also eroded the morale of the civilian population. The constant fear of the night raids, the sound of B-29 engines echoing through the skies, created a climate of terror that gripped every corner of the country. For the Japanese civilians, the bombings were a nightly reminder of their country's vulnerability and the brutal reality of the war's consequences. Fear, starvation, and disease became daily companions for the survivors, while the very spirit of resistance that had fueled Japan's military efforts began to dissipate. In addition to the civilian toll, the war had a profound effect on the Japanese military. The Air Force, already in decline by the time the B-29s arrived, suffered devastating losses. The kamikaze tactic, which had initially seemed like a desperate but effective response to the American bombers, had failed to yield the desired results. Despite their heroic attempts, the kamikaze pilots were unable to make a significant dent in the B-29 formations. The cost of these suicide missions, in both lives and aircraft, was staggering, but the hoped-for strategic advantage never materialized. Japan's air defenses had been effectively neutralized by the overwhelming power of the B-29, and no amount of desperate tactics could turn the tide of the war. As the war drew to a close, Japan's leaders were left with no choice but to accept the inevitable. They had fought with incredible tenacity, but the combined weight of the B-29 raids, the devastation wrought by the atomic bombings, and the relentless pressure from the Allied forces had finally broken their resolve. Japan's military, once proud and formidable, had been reduced to a shattered force, and the leadership knew that continuing the war was not only futile, it was now impossible. The aftermath of the B-29 raids did not only impact Japan's physical and military capabilities, it also reshaped the country's future in profound ways. When Japan finally surrendered on September 2, 1945, following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the nation found itself in a state of total devastation. The B-29 superfortress had played a pivotal role in bringing about this surrender. It had been a persistent, methodical force of destruction, stripping Japan of its industrial capacity and eroding the morale of its people. But it also marked a turning point for the nation, both in terms of its post-war reconstruction and the broader geopolitical landscape that would emerge in the years to follow. In the immediate aftermath, Japan faced an intense period of rebuilding. The infrastructure of its cities lay in ruins, and millions of civilians were displaced or wounded. The country was forced into a period of occupation under the leadership of the United States that would last for nearly 7 years. During this time, Japan's economy was reorganized, and its military, once one of the most powerful in the world, was dismantled. The B-29 raids, though a symbol of America's military superiority, also paved the way for the eventual rebuilding of Japan as a peaceful, democratic nation. But for the survivors, particularly the former pilots who had fought so hard to defend their skies, the emotional and psychological toll of the B-29 raids would linger for years. Many pilots, having witnessed the destruction of their homeland and the loss of so many of their comrades, struggled with feelings of failure and guilt. The kamikaze missions, which had been driven by the belief that their sacrifices could protect Japan, ultimately served as a reminder of the futility of their efforts in the face of overwhelming technological might. The realization that Japan had been unable to defend itself against the B-29s led to a period of deep reflection, as many soldiers and civilians alike grappled with the meaning of their sacrifice. For Japan's civilian population, the end of the war brought no immediate relief. The aftermath of the bombings was a landscape of grief and suffering. Thousands of families had lost loved ones to the raids, and those who survived faced the challenge of rebuilding their lives from nothing. The psychological wounds of the bombing raids were not easily healed. The scars of the B-29 bombings, both physical and emotional, would remain with Japan for generations. Even as the country rebuilt itself, the memory of the terror and devastation brought by the bombers haunted the collective consciousness of the nation. On the global stage, the B-29 raids marked the beginning of a new era of warfare. The superfortress, with its ability to carry out long-range strategic bombing missions, was a precursor to the kind of air power that would define the Cold War. The raids also highlighted the growing importance of technology in warfare, how technological superiority could determine the outcome of conflicts in ways that had not been possible before. The B-29, with its impressive capabilities, was an instrument of victory, but it was also a reminder of the devastation that technology could bring. In the years following the war, Japan's recovery was slow but steady. The United States, having occupied the country, began efforts to reintegrate Japan into the global community. The rebuilding process was shaped by the lessons of the war, both in terms of military strategy and the human cost of conflict. The B-29 raids, though a symbol of American victory, also became part of the larger narrative of post-war reconciliation, as both nations would eventually shift from enemies to allies. The B-29's legacy, in the eyes of many, remains a complex one. While it was a key factor in the defeat of Japan, it was also a symbol of the brutal and impersonal nature of modern warfare. The devastating raids served as a reminder of the immense cost of war, both for the military personnel involved and for the civilians caught in the crossfire. For the Japanese people, the B-29 raids were a harsh but necessary lesson in the destructiveness of conflict, a lesson that would shape the future of Japan for years to come. The B-29 superfortress raids on Japan stand as a sobering reminder of the immense destructive power of modern warfare. While they were undeniably a pivotal factor in the eventual surrender of Japan, they also highlighted the tragic and inescapable human costs of conflict. The bombers, flying night after night, relentlessly dropping bombs on both military and civilian targets, became symbols of technological triumph, but also of the unfathomable suffering that technology can unleash. For Japan, the B-29 raids were the culmination of years of relentless warfare, where every failure, every setback was magnified by the cold, impersonal precision of American air power. The lives of both the civilians and the pilots who fought to defend the nation were irrevocably changed, and the scars of that destruction would be felt for generations. What began as an attempt to break Japan's war-making capacity evolved into something far more devastating, a psychological battle that left entire cities in ruins, Entire families shattered and a once proud military exhausted and demoralized. For the Allied forces, the raids marked a turning point in the way wars would be fought in the future. The B-29, a marvel of engineering, showed just how air power could decisively alter the course of history. But as the war ended and the world began to rebuild, it also became clear that the cost of such power was not just measured in bombers or aircraft. It was measured in the lives lost, the homes destroyed, and the collective trauma of a nation. In the end, the B-29 raids were a key factor in Japan's defeat, but they also served as a grim reminder of the moral complexities that war brings. The bombers were not simply instruments of war, they were instruments of human suffering, a testament to both the ingenuity and the horrors of modern conflict. Japan's eventual recovery, both physically and psychologically, was long and difficult, but it was a recovery shaped by the lessons learned in the aftermath of those dark nights of bombing. The legacy of the B-29 superfortress, then, is not simply one of victory. It is a reminder that war, though often fought with machines, is always fought by people on both sides, and that the true cost of any conflict is felt not only in the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of those who live through it. The B-29 raids on Japan, devastating as they were, became part of a broader narrative, one of resilience, both for the country that faced such destruction and for the military personnel who, on both sides, had to come to terms with the consequences of their actions. It's a history that calls us to remember the past, not just the victories but the suffering that underpins them, and to carry forward a greater understanding of the true cost of war.